Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Bin Rajab Cultural Majlis. Some of you might be a bit confused about what a majlis is. A majlis in Arabic means a gathering place, but traditionally it's associated to a men's gathering place. In most houses, there is a majlis. It's like an annex where men gather and they invite their men friends. But this doesn't happen everywhere all the time. Like you're now in a majlis where you have people of both sexes because it's 2022 and we've come a long way. In many families, majlises are also like in a few spaces, it's gender specific, but we've come a long way from the traditional majlis to a majlis which is like this. We can talk about this later. So what I'll do now is I'll introduce Dr. Hasan Marhama. Dr. Hasan will be talking about, he'll be giving a talk called Reshaping the Past, the history and memory of the sea pearl diving trade in Bahraini folklore and poetry. We'll come to that in a bit. Dr. Hasan Marhama and I go very way, long way back. He was my university professor. He was my literature professor. And what I remember from my time at the university, which wasn't a very long time ago, was his love of poetry and everything poetry. So this is something we carry with us and we remember you for. Thank you. Dr. Hasan Marhama is the former Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Bahrain, and he also taught at the university and at the Arab Open University. He graduated from the University of Wales in 1985. Yeah? You sure? Okay. And he is the author of many books about literature. He has Voices 1 and Voices 2 about contemporary Bahraini poetry and contemporary Bahraini stories. And he has a book, The Bright Field, which has the poetry of the priest and poet Oris Thomas in Arabic. You did your PhD dissertation about Oris Thomas, right? Yeah, we remember that. And I'd like to introduce John Tabithy Willis to the group.
So good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm John Thabiti Willis, professor of African history and Africana studies at Carleton College in Minnesota in the U.S. I'm here with my brilliant students representing different majors, all of them in their second or third year and two in their senior year, coming from Carleton College. Very intellectually engaged and conscientious people here to learn and engage as well. We're here as part of an off-campus study program. So they're in essence doing a full academic term abroad here in Bahrain. And the lecture for today or this evening is part of the content of the courses that they're experiencing while they're here. So we're very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Who here has watched Sinbad? Yeah? No? Do you know who he is? Then Dr. Marhama, you'll have to tell them, right? Sinbad. Will you do that?
No, we don't do it.
Okay. Okay, so Sinbad is a seafarer, and in Bahrain we have a very long history of pearl diving, and the first record of pearl diving was from the Dilmun civilization. So you've got a lot of references to pearl diving in history, and Dr. Marhama here will be talking to us about the culture of the folklore of pearl diving from a literary perspective. He will be talking to us about where am I? He'll be talking about the songs and poems of the pearl divers and the African slaves, and which show the state of jubilance and sorrow and reflect the history as well as the memory of their agonizing past. تفضل دكتور.
Thank you very much, Amira. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here and be part of this gathering, which is proudly organized by Ben Rajab Cultural Majlis. I'd like to welcome you all to this gathering and to our talk tonight on the theme of slavery and sea pearl diving trade in Bahrain and the Gulf region, with reference to Bahraini folklore and poetry. To start with, my warmest thanks go to the organizers of this gathering, in particular to my friend and former students Yasser Ben Rajab and all members of the Ben Rajab family here in this majlis, and welcome you all to the Kingdom of Bahrain. The island, as they say, the island of Orient Pearl. Now, this phrase, Orient Pearl, has been or was popular during the 16th century England, used many Elizabethan dramatists, starting with Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare, Robert Greene, used the same phrase. I'll be referring to that later on if there's time. I've been instructed to talk about slavery and the sea pearl diving trade in Bahrain and in the region. Now, to tell the truth, I'm not a historian, though I have interest in history. But again, to be frank with you, my historical knowledge is not drawn mainly from history books, though I may confer the facts later on. But my source of these historical facts is, interestingly enough, literature. I'm a literature person, and my understanding of history is literary oriented. In other words, I usually get my historical knowledge from literature, novels, poetry, and drama, autobiography, and so on. For instance, just to start with, I learned about life and population in the United States from these memorable lines by Langston Hughes. He says in Let America Be America Again, I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. Now, well, to some extent might be true, I think. And now I know, for instance, who lives in the United States and who lived in the United States. Now, where would you find a better, more realistic picture than in these lines? Therefore, literature for me can teach us everything. If you want to know something about illness and sickness, go and read Anton Chekhov and William Carlos Williams. Both of them were physicians. If you want to know something about Africa, African life, African culture, read Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka. If you want to know something about Hindu gods, Indian culture, Indian tradition, read R. K. Narayan, Molk Raj Anand, Raja Rao. For me, as far as I am concerned, I learned about transatlantic voyage and Middle Passage voyage from the Caribbean novelist Carol Phillips. I met him in England a long time ago, and since that time I've been reading his novels. From the start, his early novels, The Final Passage, Higher Ground, Cambridge, whom I wrote a review about it together with my former colleague, Dr. Charles Sarver, to Crossing the River, to his latest, The Lost Child, and a view of the empire at the sunset. On the other hand, I learned about the history of the pearl diving trade from literature too, from Bahraini poets, and in particular from the poetry of my good friend, Mr. Ali Abdullah Khalifa, in his first collection, The Moans of the Dow Masts, and other writers in the region who displayed the jubilance as well as the pain and suffering of the sea pearl diving community in Bahrain and in the region. Now, what makes this topic of the sea pearl diving trade so interesting and worth investigating is the fact that there is some sort of analogy between the two voyages, the transatlantic and sea pearl diving voyage. Now, history books do not show you the feelings and emotions of humans, either in joy or grief. This is the duty of the writers, the poets, to do so. History only relates facts, and therefore it is only through literature that we feel the pain and suffering of humans. Human feelings are universal and can never be measured by color, creed, class, or gender. It belongs to every single creature in any environment and society. The Africans who were abducted from their villages obviously went through the feelings of pain, loss, alienation, and the tension naturally increased on the board of the ships with the barbaric treatment of the white crew. There are a few lines published in Africa's Freedom's Journal in March 1828. So, in fact, I thought I would read that for you. Very interesting. Adieu to my dear native shore. Now, this is a slave who's been abducted now saying, adieu to my dear native shore, to toss on the boisterous wave, to enjoy my kindred no more, but to weep the tears of a slave. The sea pearl divers went through the same experience. Nowadays, there are historical documents showing that there existed organized gangs financed by colonial powers at that time. which were involved in kidnapping young Africans, both men and women, and transferring them to some spots in the Gulf region for different duties. Unlike the United States, where there are various educational centers conducting research studies on slavery, African literature, in the Gulf region, any reference to slavery is not encouraged under the pretext of national unity because it's a sensitive issue. Accordingly, discussing, studying, or arguing about slavery, which is again a sensitive issue, may incite hatred among people, as they would argue. Only recently did a Kuwaiti professor, Hisham al-Awadi, broke the silence and revealed in his book, Slaves in the Arabian Gulf, published in 2021, all necessary facts about the kidnapping of Africans and transferring them to the Gulf region to work as seafarer divers. Apparently, the men who were actively involved in seafarer diving industry were either slaves or freed slaves who were imported to the Gulf, mainly from East Africa. The total number of slaves kidnapped in the 19th century and then exported abroad varies significantly. Most estimate the number of slaves who passed from the coast of Zanzibar each year from the period between 1800 and 1870 range from 6,000 to 20,000. Jerzy Zdanowiski, another researcher, in his study Slavery in the Gulf in the first half of the 20th century, published in 2008, relying on the British archives, adds another piece of information. He says, slavery and traffic of slaves in the Gulf went back to the ancient times. It also had a long record in the times of the British presence in the area as part of the British policy towards the region. And he adds that the Negro slaves were imported into Persia almost invariably, either directly from Zanzibar or from the port of Muscat. Traditional slavery, where people were kidnapped and sold as slaves far from home, was still legal and practical and practiced in large parts of the Gulf region as late as the 1970s. According to the historian Matthew Hooper, in his 1915 book, Slaves of One Master, he says, owning slaves was a sign of status limited to a small group of wealthy elites. Slaves, hence, were the most influential labor force for the seafarer diving industry, and even during or after the discovery of oil in 1932. Britain was supposed to be the guardian of the Gulf. That was one of the goals of the East India Company. And they claimed that their role was, I'm quoting, to enforce peace between warring tribes, to give a free course to trade, to stand between the slave dealer and his victim, This is from English Office Memorandum 1908. But this claim has been denied by Sheikh Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi in his book, The Myth of Arab Piracy in the Gulf. In reply to two British historians, Lorimer and Kelly, who accused some Arab tribes of piracy, Sheikh Sultan says, the people of the Gulf were normal people with normal human ambitions. The only abnormal factor was the introduction of a foreign people whose aim was to dominate and exploit. The intruders were forces of British imperialism. Whatever the British role was in the Gulf, historical records show that slavery took place in the Gulf region under the watchful eye of the British. The same thing can be said about the African slaves. The period between 1501 and 1888 witnessed the most tragic events in human history, the transfer of millions of African slaves to Europe and the American subcontinents. In the words of Phyllis Wheatley, you've heard of her, the African slave, she says, I, young in life, but seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Africa's fancied happy seat. The need of slaves as labor force was so high because there was a demand for human labor to work in sugar and cotton plantation in the Gulf region again, and in particular in Bahrain. The demands for pearls was so high, so tens of men were recruited by the pearl merchants to join the crew on the ship. In other words, and I'm quoting, the pearl necklace became one of the surest warrants of bourgeois dignity. As reported, over the 70 years from 1830 to 1900, the value of the pearl exports were multiplied by 5. However, this also had some intense consequences. There was an increase in the indebtedness of the sea pearl divers and other personnel involved in this history. To get a better and clearer picture of the situation, one can say that sea pearl trade in the Gulf region was based on a deeply rooted system of loan. According to Professor Guillemette Creuset, in his article, The British Empire in India, the Gulf Pearl, and the Making of the Middle East, published in 2019, he says, in the beginning and before the ship sails, the shipmaster, al-Nukhada, will borrow some money to equip his ship with necessary materials from the Indian merchants who had a close contact with the Bombay pearl market. The role of the Indian pearl merchants gradually decreased in the end of the 19th century, and they were replaced by the local Arab merchants. To pay back the loan, the Nokhada either sells the pearls to another merchant and pays back his loan, or sells his harvest to the lender under market price. If he is unable to pay back his debt, he will get into debt for many years or even for life. If the Nokhada was the owner of the ship, the lender, the creditor in that case, would ask him to sell his boat to pay back his debt. The same method applies to the boat crew, the seafarer drivers who had already taken loan from the Nokhada and could fall into the same trap. Hisham al-Awadi, as mentioned earlier, puts his finger on a very sensitive point. He says, while the African slaves in America worked on the plantations, the slaves in the Gulf region worked first as seafarer divers and recently as army forces or domestic labor. Al-Awadi also refers to the maltreatment of the slaves on the board of the dhow, thus ignoring the Islamic principle of tolerance. He adds, the infiltration of black citizens in the Gulf society also created some kind of racism, which eventually became merged in the culture of the country. Thus, the economic growth in the region in the past was the result of slave trade, and therefore the richness of a person was due to the number of slaves he had. Emancipation came very late. In Bahrain in 1937, Kuwait in 1952, Saudi Arabia 1962, the UAE 1963, and Oman 1971. Al-Awadi continues, his statement by saying, though the slaves became a powerful force since the period of seafarer diving, they had been marginalized in the society. And he adds, modern Gulf society preferred and is still preferring people who are economically powerful. Hisham al-Awadi, in his fully documented research, relied on the documents from the British archives and also from some pair divers who were still alive. To sum up his argument, his daring argument, he states, for years, when narrating the Gulf history, we have focused on the urban people, famous people, rich people, rulers, and the elites. This has come at the expense of sometimes silencing, skipping, overlooking, ignoring, marginalizing women, the poor, the slaves, people who had no voice. This is a very daring statement indeed by Al-Awadi. Fahd Ahmed al-Bashara, another Kuwaiti professor, in his study, The Divers' New Papers, Wealth, People, and Property in the Persian Gulf Bazaar, published in 2020 in the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, he relates a very interesting story happened in Bahrain in 1928. It's about a seafarer diver who approached the British advisor to the Emir of Bahrain, Charles Belgrave. I'm sure some of you have heard of this man. He was in Bahrain from 1926 until 1957. Powerful man at that time. The sea diver approached him asking for a manumission certificate that he has ended his slavery allowing him to work and take loan from the shipmaster or the merchant. The system of taking a loan was similar to that of pawnship, known in the US as pannoring among the African slaves. That was the practice of keeping or holding a slave until the payment or debt is done. So in the case of the seafarer diver, he will be held a slave during his life, and even after he receives his manumission, he won't be able to find a work on the ship because apparently he could not pay his full loan. In modern days, we call this the relationship of debtors versus creditors, enslavement, where a person will be enslaved to a creditor in debt bondage. Robert Carter, in his recent book, Sea of Pearls, traces the beginning of pearl diving trade in Bahrain and in the region since its ancient time until its decline in the 20th century. Carter mentions, pearl diving was certainly arduous, exhausting, uncomfortable, and injurious to the health. One of the hazards that he mentioned is the possibility that the diver would be swept away by the wind, and in that case the hauler, the person in charge of pulling him up, won't be able to pull him up. And he refers to the heat of the summer that sometimes reached 50 Celsius, and this caused severe discomfort to the divers. He also refers to the situation in particular in the early morning where the divers trembled of the cold, in addition to various skin and body diseases that the divers were subject to at the time of diving. One of the most dangerous creatures, he says, that most divers feared was the stingrays, which caused a lot of worry among the crew on the board. The rules for the sea divers on the board of the ship were strict and brutal, particularly for those divers who would be tempted to hide a pearl and would be discovered by the master. That would be obviously end in a severe punishment. This will remind us, of course, of the African slaves who endured the suffering of the long voyage and inhumane treatment of the white crew on board. The autobiography of the African slave Olada Equiano, in his diary published in 1789, clearly touches upon the suffering of the slaves on their transatlantic voyages. Frantz Fanon, the West Indian psychiatrist, in his book Black Skin and White Mask, also refers to alienation among the African slaves, the feeling of being separated from their environment. This condition can also be applied to the seafarer divers who have been away from their families for a long time and now coming home. They live like strangers in isolation and depression. Following the global recession of the 1930s, the pear and the date palm markets in the Gulf region collapsed. Many slaves who worked on the date palm plantations or in the sea pear industry were freed by their owners who had no longer or who could not no longer afford to pay them. But it took a few decades until all Arab states of the Gulf region officially banned owning the trade and trading slaves. I think the reasons for being so late in abolishing slavery were first, the seafarer industry in the Gulf had a very long established history in the region. And secondly, the economy of the region flourished because of the slaves on the board of the seafarer ship. As a result, many ports were built in the area. And thirdly, seafarer diving trade involved the interests of European and Indian and regional investors, traders, and merchants. In other words, it was a prosperous business. Seafarer diving trade was profitable, that the authorities could not afford stopping it, almost like the plantation owners who opposed to the abolishing of slavery in America and Europe. In the case of seafarer diving industry, as said earlier, colonial powers at that time were the authorities, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, not speaking about the regional powers, the Persians, Omanis, and the Turks. The complex structure of the seafarer diving industry requires some attention here. Excuse me. The complex structure of the seafarer diving industry in the region and in Bahrain in particular requires some attention. It reminds us to some extent of the same structure applied in the transfer of the Africans to America or other continents. In both cases, regional and local powers were involved. Let us look briefly at the structure of the seafarer diving industry in Bahrain. At the top ladder came the money suppliers, who were mostly, but not all, Asians. Then the pearl merchants, then the dhow owners, and at the bottom came the sea divers, who were grouped into various classes. On the board of the ship, there were the shipmaster, Nokhada, followed by his assistant, usually an old sea diver, then the sea diver, the hauler, the one who pulls up the diver from the sea, the singer or an-naham, and in most cases there will be more than one, the trainee or the apprentice, then the cleaner and the cook. Almost like the long transatlantic voyage, which carried the slaves from one port to another, from one voyage to another, from Bristol in England to Bordeaux and to the Rhode Island and to the Brazilian ports, the same journey made by the sea divers, enduring the heat of the summer, diving to the bottom of the sea, resisting the attacks by the sea sharks and other threats, only to pick up the one precious seashell, the pearl, which was exported to many countries to be worn by rich and wealthy men and women, and of course the most famous woman in the universe, Cleopatra of Egypt and Queen Elizabeth of England. Having said so, and despite of all these dangers and hardship, one must admit that the pearls brought beauty and splendor to the women in Asia and Europe. Just have some lines by Shakespeare to entertain us. In the words of Shakespeare, he says, "The liquid drops of tears that you have shed shall come again, transformed to an orient pair, advantaging their loan with interest of 10 times double gain of happiness." Shakespeare in this stanza presents us with the image of the pearl as a symbol of the Orient beauty, but at the cost of shedding tears. Now, another poet, the Irish poet Thomas More, 1779-1852, also provides some marvelous picture. "And precious the tear as that rain from the sky, which turns into pearls as it falls in the sea." Look at the way that they compare the pearl to the rain every time. The period of prosperity in the sea pearl diving industry, though, brought competition among the colonial powers in the area, and yet also its decline. Several reasons are attributed to that, to its decline. First of all, the abundant production of Japanese cultured pearls, the financial depression of 1929, the discovery of oil in Bahrain in 1932, which opened new vacancies for Bahraini men and women, and apparently the Maharaja class in India was the best consumers of the pearls of the Gulf. So when India became independent in 1947, the class was abolished and the demand for the pearl decreased. And of course, the last reason is the establishment of the formal school in Bahrain in 1939, which gave the young men the opportunity to join. The gradual disappearance of the sea pearl diving trade certainly left behind both good and sad memories, which are still alive in the minds of the people of the region. Many, even today, still remember the hardship of the trade, including the pain borne by the sea divers and the patience of their families awaiting their return. They reiterate the lyrics sung at that time of farewell and on the board of the ships and in their return. These lyrics, which eventually became part of the country's folklore, are called al-Mawal. Like the African slave labor on sugar plantations who would work from the dawn to the nightfall, the pearl sea divers also went through the same experience, working from the dawn until the sunset, only to stop for fair lunch, and that would be a meager amount of rice and fish. Sir Edwin Arnold, the 19th century English poet, who's also famous for his masterpiece, The Light of Asia, and most probably visited Bahrain, records a beautiful lines, the scene where the sea pearl diver meets his wife on the shore. Dear as the wet diver to the eyes of his pale wife, who waits and weeps on shore by sands of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, plunging all day in the blue waves at night, having made up his toll of precious pearls, rejoins her in their hut upon the shore. The Bahraini researcher Abdullah Khalifa Shamlan, in his book The Pear Industry, published in 2012, provides a detailed account of pear industry in the Gulf region, mentioning various steps in this profession. In the preface to his book, he says, "The talk about the sea diving is full of longing and dear memories concerning the most essential source of livelihood in Bahrain and the Gulf Arab region in general, before the discovery of oil in 1932. He also mentions that the first reference to the pear diving in history was recorded in the epic of Gilgamesh, 3,000 years BC, where the pear was called the eye of the fish. As said earlier, the sea pear industry in the Gulf region was strongly connected to the history of the people of the region because it was the only profession which secured their livelihood. Indeed, it needed patience, severity, and physical strength and ability to bear difficulties. The Indian poet Rohini Sondram, who visited Bahrain, clearly illustrates the restraints imposed on the sea pear diver on the board. He says, "With the stones on his feet down he dived to the rocks where the pearl beds lay. He closed his eyes against the salt. He pinched his nose with a date palm pig while he harvested those pearls of rose and grey, harvested the grapes of eternal day in the twice blessed waters of a tiny bay off the island of Muharraq near Bahrain, of the waters green that spread between Muharraq and Bahrain." The diving season lasted for 4 months, and the men in the board had to be far away from their homeland and families. To spend that long period on the board of the dhow, they needed a consoler, someone who would relieve them from their hardship. Therefore, on every ship, there was a singer who was called locally a Naham. And his duty was to communicate with the divers in his melancholic lyrics, which would help them to continue their duty and ease their grief. It's very interesting to mention here in this regard the songs sung on the transatlantic voyages. Obviously, that singing, generally speaking, was meant for communication, to communicate with each other. That was part of African culture and tradition. The singing was done collectively, and the other slaves answered also again collectively. But those songs were not meant only to ease, but also to heal. There was some kind of spiritual tinge in those songs sung by the African slaves, a sort of spiritual medicine. The slaves on the board of the dhow, the sea pear slaves, followed the same ritual. While a Naham sang, the other sea divers repeated the lyrics, almost like the African slaves. Let's bring, for a while, the notorious Mr. Sigmund Freud here. I'm sure some of you like him. In psychology, It says, and I'm quoting, the present in our lives is ever closely bound up with the past, and the cord that unites them is all woven of strains of memory. Now, you don't have to misunderstand me, and I don't want to focus on that anymore. This quotation is from Francis Power Cobb in The Fallacies of Memory, 1867. Now, according to our friend, Mr. Freud, now every one of us has got two spheres, one called conscious, one is unconscious, as you all know. Now, the conscious, now I'm speaking to you and I'm conscious. But the unconscious that he refers to is triggered off, kicked off in the state of intoxication, that you are drunk, or madness. But we can add also that too much depression puts someone in a state of trance. And this can be eased or calmed down in a ritual accompanied by singing and dancing. Now, there is an interpretation for that I don't like to go further. Here, the singing and dancing are performed for the purpose of healing. In the songs of An-Naham, the unconscious, the forbidden stored memories are triggered off. And once again, there is a unity of voice and identity with the African slaves on the transatlantic voyage. Therefore, the singer An-Naham was essential on every voyage, and his songs were closely related to what the divers were doing. The divers also played the role of the chorus, as I said, by repeating certain lines with the singer. The lyrics were usually rhymed and sung in a local dialect. Together with the vocals, there were certain musical instruments, especially the drum, which is, I'm sure, you know, it's basically an African instrument. Which was frequently used along with the songs. The themes of the lyrics were often chosen by the shipmaster. So for every movement on the ship, there would be a song relevant to the situation, which meant to encourage the divers for work in groups. Now, as the seafarer divers left the town, as I said earlier, with this, there is always a ritual. As they left the town, the rising of their song echoed in the sky. This is a translation of one of those lyrics. Today, again, I sail out to dive to the deepest blue of the sea below. Today, once again, you know, I'll strive for a pair that I can show. So, heave, you rowers, heave. I say, today is that day, O morning sun. Come, bless our dive, make fortune smile on us today. Pardon our sins and bless our lives in the name of Allah. We do pray. So heave, you rowers, heave, I say. Today is that day. Today is that day. It's therefore necessary to mention that the seafarer diving profession became, as years passed, symbol of perseverance, especially in Bahrain, embedded in the culture identity of Bahraini society and the Gulf region as a whole, and the continuity of this identity on various dimensions: economic, social, and regional. It became a social tradition connecting different classes in Bahrain, which are well preserved by the people until now. The same thing can be said about the African oral tradition, or even African American vernacular, which has become part of the African American tradition. Excuse me. Now I would like to digress a little bit, but on the same track, to talk about how humans appreciate scenes, how they show feelings towards a particular scene from nature. For example, since we are still talking about the sea, the ocean, how do we view and appreciate the sea? The sea, as you know, has always been the source of some kind of inspiration to poets and other writers. But obviously the sea has different connotations from one person to another. I don't want to enter into the field of linguistics and the sign theories of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, but surely I would agree with him that the meaning in a word is arbitrary, meaning there is no connection with the word or sign as used it, the sound, the signifier, and its meaning, the signified. In other words, when I say a lion, it cannot only refer to an animal living in the jungle. We can say that he is as brave as a lion, though he's not a lion physically speaking. So in any text, there is a sort of cultural intervention. And as I said earlier, there are hundreds of poems in this regard showing the beauty of the sea. But it's very interesting to listen to the American poet Walt Whitman, whom I really admire. He says, "To me, the sea is a continual miracle. The fishes that swim, the rocks, the motion of the waves, the ships with men in them. What stranger miracles are there?" Obviously, this is not the sea where the African slaves or on their transatlantic voyage or the sea divers in their diving mission experienced. Well, this doesn't mean, of course, that the romantic perspective of nature is dull, tedious, or unexciting. No, never. Despite of the widespread of the tech in our society, our societies nowadays, we still agree with our nature guru, William Wordsworth, who said, "Nature never did betray the heart that loved her." So let us come back to this romantic perspective where the poets start to describe the natural beauty of the sea, avoiding any reference to its brutality. And gladly speaking, this romantic tendency can also be applied to the sea pair divers at work. Yes, why not? There is a romantic view, a romantic portrait of the sea, where the beauty of the ocean touched upon. The heroic deed and the bravery of the forefathers are shown. I'll be quoting some lines by Bahraini poet in this regard in a minute. On the other hand, we have another perspective, a realistic portrait where the sea is seen as the cause of death. The realistic perspective displays the pressure laid on the sea divers, which are both physical and psychological. Some descriptions of the seafarer divers could be described or labeled as absurd, in the sense that the efforts of the sea divers are blown away, which means they do the hardest work, but the pearls go to someone else. Recently, some poets in Bahrain and the Gulf region have begun to give the sea a symbolic significance. The pearl symbolizes beauty and splendor worn by the beautiful mistress. But again, symbolism is an extension of romanticism. A romantic poem can also be heavy on metaphors and symbols, and at the same time can emphasize individuality and emotion. One of the poets of this trend was Abdullah Zayed, born in the famous town of Al-Muharraq, the former capital of Bahrain, or Aradus, as the Greeks called it, known for its cultural splendor and traditional Bahraini houses and narrow lanes. As Zayed, who first followed his father's profession as a pearl merchant, but later charged by the British for making artificial pearls, and he was exiled to India. He has some memorable lines that he wrote at the end of his age, expressing his agony and lamenting his fate. Wearied with life and long vigil, I long for death, and the grave as my residence. For in depth, misfortunes are at distance, if time betrays or proves brutal. I'd like here to start with one of the early romantic poets who sang of the sea-fair divers, Ahmed Muhammad Al-Khalifa, who was also influenced by the master poet Ibrahim al-Arayid of the 20th century, and showed some touches of realism as well in his poetry. He's one of the early 20th century poets in Bahrain who wrote about the sea-fair diving or divers' experience as motivated by a sense of pride and with purpose of eulogy, using delightful images full of inspiration. In one of his early poems entitled The Sea Diver's Ode, he says, I am the diver in the sea. Patience and diligence my allies be. With the furious wind I drive. In attacks and retreats I always survive. My old age taught me with courage and patience to have glee. With an ambitious heart I am sealed. To free work I yield. I am the son of far distant waves, who in darkness and in dawn craves. Now, this is a poem of celebration and jubilance, and it depicts the joy and the pride of the sea-fair diver. It has some touches of history, as it shows how the young diver prepares himself for sailing by learning the necessary qualities to step on the ship as a seafarer diver. Seafarer diving profession needs patience, and the poem clearly touches upon that. For Muhammad Ahmed Al-Khalifa, to be on the board of the seafarer diving ship is a social gathering. It's a meeting where all seafarer divers gather to sing and to tell stories or to listen to the lead singer An-Naham, whose responsibility was to entertain the sea divers. Having said so, the real meaning of these songs lies within the heart of the poet. I'm sure you've come across Frederick Douglass, explained in his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, saying, they, the slaves on the plantation, would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiment in the most rapturous tone, and the most rapturous sentiment in the most pathetic tone. Now, this could be joyful for some, but for many, it is full of sorrow. Muhammad Ahmed Al-Khalifa, who presented us with delightful pictures of the seafarer divers, also sang to the island of Bahrain, Awal. He says in one of his poems entitled My Homeland, Awal is the name, one of the names given to Bahrain, in addition to Dilmun and Tylos. Awal, are you a charm or beauty, that in your grace we stray, a fineness cleansing the nights, a magic that minds fail to portray, a wealth of garden wishes, in whose bosom beauty is gay. Your shores are beheld from afar, caressed by the waves in a charming way. On the ground the palm trees embrace, while envied by the mountains as they sway. As said earlier, every aspect of the seafarer diving experience was accompanied by some kind of ritual. For instance, the arrival of the divers home has its ceremony. Many families would celebrate by hanging a flag on the top of the roof of the house. It is indeed the sign of celebration. The poet Qasim Haddad, contemporary poet, well-known Bahraini poet of this century, in his collection Portent, describes this celebration by referring to the Greek mythical figure Sisyphus, associating him, Sisyphus, with the brave sea diver who has now come back home. This is not a romantic perspective. He says, Qasim Haddad, my garment, my mother's garment, flapping on the spiring roof of our house, portends Sisyphus, who once vanished, has emerged carrying the rock of mankind. Ah, sea of ashes, Sisyphus has emerged, and the free need only gesture. On his forehead there is the sign of a wounded yearning, and his hand, the veins weep over the crippled past, a monotonous melody. Sisyphus has emerged. Haddad, Qasim Haddad, is the poet of hope. Now he is in his 80s now. The misery of the diver will be over, he says, soon, and those who cause that misery will fall. He says, ah, Sisyphus, like you, we will join daytime, will dive in the heart of the seas, penetrate the heart of the night, the heart of impossibility, and carry mankind and burn on our shores the sea dogs and sorrows. But to understand the full picture of the sea pair divers, their joys and sorrows, one has to read the poetry of Ali Abdullah Khalifa, Qasim Haddad's contemporary. Ali Abdullah Khalifa is perhaps one of the most socially committed poets of this century in Bahrain, a poet of a powerful sensitivity and sound ability to delineate undiluted and vivid pictures of the past and the present Bahrain society in his poetry. According to Dr. Alawi al-Hashimi, a poet and critic at the same time, he says, Dr. Alawi al-Hashimi, Ali Abdullah Khalifa exposed the tragedy of the sea pair divers to the contemporary readers by rendering all its aspects into a poetic subject in its first volume, Moans of the Dow Masts. As said earlier, during the departure of the sea divers, usually there would be a celebration, a farewell celebration, where all the people of the town would gather on the shore, performing a musical gathering to bid farewell to the sea pair divers. This scene by itself is heartbreaking, especially for the mothers and the young wives who would look at their sons and husbands with eyes full of tears. Ali Abdullah Khalifa, the poet, describes this scene in the following lines. Alas, they have sailed. Woe to sorrow, woe to what permeates my depths and rages in madness. Woe to the days fed on suffering for deserting my frail and crumbled body. Here they are sailing, all comrades, ebullient at farce. Their oars pierce the sea fiercely and harmoniously, while the masts moan, though with a naham in a melancholic cadence that is unbearable. This is indeed an agonizing moment for both the mother and the wife. And Ali Abdullah Khalifa touches on that with somehow delicate touch. Loneliness and the grief of the evening, the roars of the waves and the woman's chatter, and the full of a single tears from a child's eye, who, in the torrent of fever. Now, what will happen to this young sea diver when he's old, when old age devours him? Once he was strong and defiant, but as he grows older, the scene changes. Ali Abdullah Khalifa says, a dignified giant, a man thrown on the shore like a dead body, wiped out by the sea and driven back by the despot's laws, and having lived his prime years crucified among his starving children, and a caller demanding his debts. And finally, he addresses the sea in a heartbreaking tone. Ah, sea, our tales are never ending, wearied by the night and discarded by the noon. Diving has exhausted me, but is still my captor. Here I have been created as a leftover of a despising refuse. To cheer you up, I'd like to end my talk by quoting some sweet goodnight lines by our friend Langston Hughes. Bring me all of your dreams, you dreamers. Bring me all of your heart melodies, that I may wrap them in a blue cloud cloth, away from the too rough fingers of the world. Now, before I say goodnight, I'd like to say that I'm very much interested in learning from you. I have interest in African literature, African tradition. So please, as our friend, now all these poets now becoming friends, as our friend Shakespeare says, if music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it. Thank you very much, and a very good night to you, and Ramadan Kareem.
Thank you, Dr. Marhama. That was very, very informative. You've been very humble when you said you're not a historian. He was a historian, right?
I'm not a historian.
Yeah, but you, yeah, and you rekindled this love of poetry. You took me back to 30 years ago when I was a student in your classroom. So we'll open the floor for questions. Dr. Mansour.
Thank you very much indeed. It was diving deep into history, coming to today's world. And you touched on the sensitivities of covering issues related to slavery. And I think there are 2 points that I would like to add here. Number one, there is a chapter of Black Africans in Bahrain that is not covered, but could be covered positively, which is Thawrat al-Zinj, the Zinj revolt, the Black African revolt. And they ruled Bahrain for 20 years. The American embassy in Bahrain is located in Zinj. Zinj is actually the area, the capital, where they ruled Bahrain in the 9th century when they revolted against the Abbasid Caliphate in Basra and extended, but their capital, and they ruled from Bahrain. And that 20 years, history of Bahrain, and we have a lot of people as well. Still, if you go to Zinj and you stare at the eyes of the people, you could see they are African. Actually, their hairs, and although they mixed with race, but I've got friends from Zinj, and they really, when you look at them, they're Africans. So really, that we have a page of African rule in Bahrain for 20 years, and this rule has been condemned. The Zinj revolt has been condemned by Arab historians and by Muslim historians, but I think we need to revisit that one, and we may not have to condemn it with the line of critically appraising what has happened and how we look at it. So that's one point. The other point is really the sensitivity transcends not only the African slavery in Bahrain, but also we had a system of indenture in Bahrain, which is a sukhra. And next year, 2023, will be 100th year since the banning of sukhra by the British. And the sukhra was semi-slavery, which was applied or imposed on the local population. So we had slavery, which is not covered, and it is a very touchy subject. And we had the sukhra, which is indenture system applied against the locals in Bahrain. And really, we are now just only 100 years ago, basically, when that was applied. So maybe what you have touched upon is something could invite more coverage with less sensitivity. Thank you very much.
Cannot be covered in reality. See, that's why I said every time it's trying to remind the audience that do not misunderstand me. As you said, a valid point, and I agree with you. But I can't elaborate on that. I'm sorry. But the book by this Kuwaiti man, published recently, unfortunately, it's not been translated into English. The Slaves in the Arabian Gulf by Hisham Al-Awadi. It's a very interesting book, and I wonder if it is available in Bahrain. But Hisham Al-Awadi, I think he reveals every point in the issue of slavery in Bahrain, in the Gulf region, Kuwait in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It was very informative and very interesting. I just wanted to highlight about the book of Hisham Al-Awadi. I get to know about the book by Dr. Ali Deri. He did the review in Arabic, and anyone can listen to SoundCloud, the app. So it's exactly, I was really amazed. I just came recently from Africa, specifically from Mauritius, and I get the chance to visit the National Museum, and I get to understand a lot about the history of slavery, specifically in Indian Ocean and in East Africa, and also about the Indian labor, which was brought up by the British to this particular island. So I was really amazed to see how the link with the Gulf region, and to link it to the market, and to get to know what Hisham Al-Awadi mentioned in his book. And I have to give a credit to the Kuwaiti scholars who have the opportunity in their university to do these kind of research compared to the one we have, with all respect, here in Bahrain. But I would love to see more research in the Gulf region, like what we see in University of Kuwait. So Hisham Al-Awadi highlighted about the market of slavery in Mecca, and also in Muscat, and link it with Zanzibar. And then that explains why we had a lot of slavery brought up to the Gulf region through the Mecca market and Muscat to Bahrain and to Kuwait from an island like Seychelles. So, and also about the music. Yes, I do agree. The music, not just which came out from the divers, is about sorrow. And weeping and misery and all that, but it is also part of the slavery culture, which built in islands brought up by the colonialism by the Europeans. So the sugarcane plantation that started by the Dutch, bringing all these sugarcane plantation from Indonesia all the way to Mauritius. And also the market which was flourished in Seychelles and then into the Gulf. It all has a lot of story to tell. And that's why when you look to our faces in the Gulf region, we are so mixed. You cannot just say, I am very pure. That's not correct. We come from different places and different races. So it can tell you the story or the untold story about the region. And I don't know when, maybe Hisham started, and maybe it could be continued by others. And thank you very much.
So it needs some kind of, and especially I'm talking about historians. They need to dig more into this subject. Now, as you said, in Kuwait they've started, and I hope at least in Bahrain, for a while, just getting out of this romantic perspective of seabird diving and go to the business once again. About the second point that you've mentioned again about the Indian labor, you are right, but I didn't mention it because I didn't want to mix it with the African slaves. You are right. The pearl merchants were mostly Indians, and at the same time, the labor, some of the labor, in addition to the Africans, were of Indian origin at the same time. But I didn't want to mix it up together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. You've honored us in such detail with the thoughtful, insightful, the wide range, the breadth of the research that you've presented for us today, connecting the transatlantic, the Gulf, the Indian Ocean, connecting poetry, giving us a deep lesson into history on both sides of the continent. So, we're humbled. We're just excited about what it is you've shared with us tonight. Two questions. One, you briefly referenced the notion of the Islamic principle of tolerance with respect to slavery. If you could elaborate more on this, I think it's an important aspect that I imagine you have a lot to say about, and that speaks really deeply and profoundly to the history of slavery. And then as well, the songs of divers and the ways in which those songs live on in heritage performances today in various festivals. I attended one of the Sea festivals back in 2018 and heard a range of songs associated with pearling. So if you could speak to that as well, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Well, about the tolerance, you need a mullah to be here, not to talk about religion. The principle of tolerance, as a matter of fact, I mean, if you ask any person, he would tell you or she would tell you, but I can't do it because this is not my field, And sometimes there are certain boundaries that you can't do. The songs of the divers, as I said, I mean, again, I don't want to elaborate on that, but then if you look at it carefully, the songs accompanied by some kind of a musical instrument. The men in excitement, the sea divers are in excitement. As I said, among the African slaves, the singing had some kind of healing. Now, this is the point where I left and on top. Now, here in our society, sometimes we call that person has got zar. You see, then how would you treat a person with a zar? You put him in the middle and surrounded by people singing and dancing until that zar leaves him away. Now, zar is sort of a trance, but the trance is a sort of acceptable word. But medically, it's a sort of hallucination. That's why I didn't want to talk about that. But it comes almost to the same stage. And again, with the African slaves, as you know, for instance, the one who sings or does whatever he wants to do, then there is that repetition with the other slaves, although the crew on the board didn't understand that, but there was some kind of communication. Now, that is the word that I use, communication. Communication, some of you probably are fully aware, communication within the soul, you see, within the spirit, within you. You have to communicate with that thing inside the person to get it out to whatever. And I'm sure that many of you have seen those Egyptian movies where that such a kind of ritual is performed, or even in this region. So the songs, the reason again that I refer to Freud and in psychology, because I think memory, I might be wrong, memory relates, memory is connected to other species, whoever those are. The memory of the person. For instance, among the members of the family, you find that the same memory is shown. I mean, but in a sort of a better picture. Now, one has to look at it from the psychological point of view to find out how the seafarer divers behave like the African slaves. You see, in psychology, it says that it's always connected, something that you can't see, but it is connected through memory. Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much thank you for giving me the opportunity. My name is Ala Al Yusuf, and I very much admired cousin. Talk to you in a minute. Just want to salute your approach, a literary tour de force of a very tricky subject in the region. And may I just take this opportunity to also make a shameless plug for Abdullah Zayed, the Nobel Prize winner last year in literature, English literature, who touched upon this subject with vivid references to the Gulf and Bahrain, Zanzibar and Oman and so on. So I wonder what you like his work and you approve of his approach. And I think I've learned a lot from him anyway. Thank you.
Yes, I have heard of Abdullah Zayed. He's himself from Zanzibar. But unfortunately didn't have time to look at his piece of work on slavery and the Gulf. But some of his novels I read long time ago. I mean, that was probably the time that I was at the university. But you're absolutely right. He's I met him in England again together with Carl Phillips there long time ago. I'm looking forward to reading his manuscript. Thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking you. I'm just so honored to have heard this presentation, and I cannot express how much we have to talk about, and the overlaps between my own studies and a lot of the topics that you've talked about, both for me studying more the blues in America and reggae in Jamaica, and the resonances of a lot of the topics that you're talking about within musics across the diaspora and within poetry. And one thing that I really appreciated from your talk was the emphasis. There's along the narrative of Africans and slavery, there can be a emphasis on the sorrow that's very deeply ingrained in the music, and a problematic historical granting of provisional humanity based on that sadness and emotionality that is present in the music. And also, as your talk emphasized very strongly, there's also a lot of motivation and pride and happiness that is also expressed in that music. And it feels very uplifting to be left with Langston Hughes reminding us to dream proudly and imaginatively. And in light of our studies looking into heritage and how history is told in the global and national, local heritage is created, I'd like to ask you how you think this type of poetry, these narratives and discussions, can be integrated into creating and emphasizing parts of both local identity within our neighborhoods, national identity within Bahrain, a regional identity across the Gulf, and also a global identity as we understand what it means to be human.
Some of these poets whom I refer to, contemporary poets of Bahrain, they are studied at the university. But basically, you know, we don't have the same educational centers as you have in the United States. Now, in the United States, in every university, as I understand, there is a small center related to the African American tradition or culture. I mean, there are many of them.
We don't have a center
No.
in the university for any culture.
So this is the point. Yes. So, some of the poets whom I refer to are studied here. Those students who are studying Arabic literature or majoring in Arabic, they come across these names for sure. Now, of course, we have many poets, but there is one thing that I've noticed in among the new generation, new poets, that their themes now, they are departing from the old themes of, let's say, seafarer diving and the tradition. They are focusing on modern themes related to the society, related to the problems of Bahrain and the Gulf.
Hello. I would like to first thank you so much for the lecture. This has been what I've been waiting for since I came to Bahrain, so thank you. And I would like to start by saying that you show such a clear devotion to literature, especially as a catalyst for expanding worldview and sort of increasing an appreciation for humanity. And with that in mind, I noticed that there was a consistent referencing to enslaved African people as mere African slaves. And I do fear that that may create a barrier between recognizing the particular dehumanization of slavery. The term itself could also potentially create a buffer between recognizing Afro-Arab and particularly Black Bahraini people's visibility within society and their culture, as it is very surface level. And again, I do feel that it detracts from their humanity. So I am interested in knowing your thoughts on this, and if I have to elaborate more, I can. I apologize if it's unclear. But yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question. No, just the last.
People don't sort of think of black and this is white and this is not, but in reality it exists. So when we say black and slave and the word, it's not used in the same context as the people. So here they don't even see that there is a problem. That's a problem itself for you. But here like there isn't like this research, all of this is new for us. For us, to hear all this is new. The book by this country author is something new. It's a new book that was released last year. Most of us have not had a chance to read it. These are not issues that are part like actually, how do I see it? Yeah, like there isn't, I don't know, like black people here actually have better job opportunities than many of the locals. They have access to Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had a discussion about the black in Bahrain, and we did mention that by no means you can compare the black experience in the West generally with the ones in the Gulf and specifically in Bahrain. It's very different. Sometimes you are privileged to be black because you are an entourage of the elite. So in terms of job opportunity, housing, you are more privileged than the white Bahrainis. Having said that, I mentioned in my thesis that I think one of the most oppressed community in Bahrain is those descendants of the Africans, because they don't even speak up. I think lots of people did mention here, we talk about the black, but until now we have not had black Bahrainis who speak up as a community or as an ethnic group who have their own rights and demands. Because I think from my analysis that they have a lot at stake to lose compared to other Bahrainis. I mean, I can give lots of examples, but it will not be very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for your talk today. I'm just wondering, are there any narratives from enslaved people in Bahrain, as for example we have in the US from, say, Frederick Douglass? Yeah, like narratives of their experience that we can turn to today.
I remember there are those songs and lyrics that we call mawal. But if you're asking me, same as Frederick Douglass, no, I haven't come across that. But I know that there are lyrics, songs sung at the time of departure and arrival. And of course, we have the poems that I read some of them. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much again. I think I can speak on behalf of all my peers. Like Tay said, this is something we've been waiting for a while. I do have a question about just how do you foresee education in the Gulf opening up more dialogue and conversations about slavery in the Gulf, as seen as it's something new that hasn't really been talked about before. What are your suggestions to, opening up more conversations about slavery in the Gulf, but also, uplifting Black voices here in the Gulf as well? Thank you.
I wanted to thank you once again for coming here on this amazing speech. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on the role of women and children in the Gulf in Bahrain during the slavery of the pearl divers, and if there's any literature and poetry talking and describing the day-to-day lives and struggles of women and children who are left behind by the pearl divers, who are often enslaved for generations.
A sea pearl diver would come to his town, and by chance he would get married, okay? And he would stay with that woman for some time, and then he leaves and comes back to find out that his wife has got a baby. Now, as I said, it's a sort of universal feeling. I mean, it's not about the wives and the mothers in Bahrain. Everywhere the same thing. I mean, if a wife is left behind or a mother is left behind, everywhere is the same. I mean, the same thing happened to the women in the Gulf, not only Bahrain, in the Gulf region, who now would stay with without the husband for a long time. And the feelings are almost universal. And the mothers, the wives, the whole family is affected by that. But of course, as I said again, the point that I'm coming back to, that was part of their livelihood. I mean, the mother would encourage the son to go and join that, because the loan that the seafarer diver gets from a nokhada, that loan keeps them living for a long time. And that's why that story with Charles Belgrave, that the man wants something to show to the master that he is no longer a slave, he's finished, so that he can join. But of course, they wouldn't look at it from that point of view. They would look at it from the point that, has he finished his debt? Has he paid? So this is the most important thing. But again, most families would encourage their sons to join the dhow ship, the seafarer diving industry, to get the loan from nokhada or from the fair merchant for their family. And of course, as I said, I mean, they have to be. The whole profession, the whole industry is based on patience, suffering, pain, and it's like in any family like that. It's not only in Bahrain or in the Gulf region. Wherever you want to look at it, you find that, as Hisham Al-Awadi said, that these people, the women, almost been marginalized by the society. I hope. Thank you. Yeah, they were, yes, they were black and they were Indian. Mm-hmm. You can say it.
I don't like to use the word black and white. You know, a Bahraini African author, Nasr al-Khair. I don't know, doctor, if you are aware about this name, Nasr al-Khair. Khairi, Nasr al-Khairi. He's a Bahraini African, or was, yani, from last century, and unfortunately, what remained now from his work is very limited, and it was collected by certain group of authors here in Bahrain. I don't know if there is any translation from Arabic into English, but it will be really interesting to highlight this author from the Gulf and from Bahrain. As well as you can really dig more, because Hisham Al-Awadi, in his book, he mentioned how these Africans were kidnapped from the shores from East Africa to be brought up to the Gulf region. So yeah, there are a lot of stories in Bahrain, and maybe Dr. Sausan, she knows some of them, and I know some of them, but you know, it is a very sensitive to dig, because they will lose more than they will gain, and there is a big difference between the one what we have here in the Gulf or in Bahrain compared to the one in the United States.
Thank you. There is a novel written by King Saud's son, who is an academic in the university, in one of the universities in Saudi Arabia. He basically narrates the story of his mom, who was a slave and was, I think the book is called Qalbun min Banqalan, and the author's name is Saiful Islam bin Saud bin Abdul Aziz. And his mom was a slave, so he's a son of a slave, and his father, King Saud, was a son of a slave and became the king of Saudi Arabia. And actually, we have many rulers in the region who were sons of slaves. So that does tell you something about the culture here and how different it is from the European or the white experience in the West. Very different. You can become a king and you are a black in an Arab land.
You don't mind?
Thank you, Doctor, for all the information. My name is Captain Ahmed Zayed, and I am an ex-seafarer. I have two things to add. Maybe the first one is an observation. And my observation is, as being a seafarer, I don't think listening to the romantic poets, I don't think there is romance going to sea. There is no romance of going to sea. And that also reminds me of the old tradition that took place during the slavery in Europe, where when one slave dies, they throw him overboard as a burial procedures. That tradition has unfortunately carried on until maybe 30 years ago. I was at sea 30 years ago. This is one thing. The other thing is, I just want you, if you could please shed some light on the chain of operation when it comes to, say, hiring the ship and how it works. Because in our today's marine matters, if you want to call it, we've got things that is called voyage charter, time charter, and bareboat charter. Bareboat charter is where a company or individual will charter or rent the whole ship and do whatever he wants to do with that ship. A time charter is an individual, again, or a company will charter the ship for a limited number of days or time or year or month or whatever. And then comes the voyage charter, where you could just charter a space in the ship. So how did it work at the time of slavery when they come to charter a pearl fishing boat or a dhow before they go for pearling? Thank you.
I think the Bahraini researcher Shamlan referred to that. Was it that or another Kuwaiti researcher? As I said, and this is of course not my information from the books that I read about slavery, it seems with the structure of seafarer diving industry was based on the following. The first one was the supplier who pays money. Whoever that supplier is, some people would say that they were Asians or Indians related to the pearl market in Bombay. It could be local people. Now, this one, the top, he is in charge of everything because he's in charge of money. Therefore, the money is that the Nokhadad, the master of the ship, gets, and then the seafarer diver gets, is from that top man. This is my understanding of the whole situation, of the structure of the industry itself. That's why, for instance, sometimes it happens as you said, you see the whole journey fails. It doesn't mean that every time they go on a voyage they come back with pearls. No, that was not the case. In most cases, in some cases they fail, and therefore the Nokhada himself now is in trouble. This is what was going on at that time, but I think it's quite different from your view. Thank you. Last question.
It's actually not a question. It's just to add some further historical context to the question. As you said, that's completely correct about the way that the team working together on the ship. But to add further into the individual relationship, as Professor Marhama has mentioned, it's very based on debt, and the sailors, the divers, they would rent their spaces on the boats individually. That would be a part of what put them in so much debt, because they'd rent it at the beginning of the season. That would be a payment that they'd have to pay off through their work. So I think if I remember your question correctly, it was more the third one of an individual renting a space on the boat so they could work.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was just really interested when you were talking about the structure of the pearl industry, and I was wondering if you could talk more about the different roles on the ship. You mentioned very briefly about the puller, and I was just wondering if you could talk more about the daily struggles that they faced and some of the challenges. If you could elaborate further on that and just giving more context and what you've received from just the literature and the poetry that you've read, that would really be helpful. Thank you.
Now imagine yourself on the board of a dhow, okay? Now you've got a number of sea divers together. There is a singer. There's, of course, you have to every time go deep into the sea 10 times, 15 times, because not every time you are successful. Then you wait for your food, mostly rice and fish. And then, of course, to encourage you to work is the singer himself. And therefore, he sings and you repeat. And he sings and you repeat. It's almost like some kind of energy that you get from that singer. And that's why I said in most cases it seems to be that there are more than one Naham there, too. But it's sort of collaborative work, collectively done. They all work together with the watchful eye of the master Nokhada there, and all the sea divers there, and by turn they go deep into the sea and they come back. So that was the whole operation, like that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marhama. Thank you all for your questions. Dr. Marhama will be here. You can talk to him one-on-one. Thank you very much. Good night.